Hello and welcome to the live post-game coverage of Florida State basketball presented by the FSView and Florida Flambeau. I'm your host, Ben Meyerson, and I'm a staff writer for the FSView. And today I'm joined by the editor of the FSView, Thomas Martinez. You can expect these live streams for a number of Florida State basketball games throughout the rest of the regular season. Our next game we're going to be covering is the Monday Virginia Cavaliers game. And you can find these streams on the FSView Sports Twitter page at FSView Sports. Welcome, Thomas. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate you coming on this inaugural live stream.
It's good to see you, Ben. And what a good first game to do this for. Florida State winning 92-85 over Wake Forest today in overtime.
Yeah. What an excellent game for Florida State. And like you're saying, for us to cover for this first live post game. This is their second overtime victory of their season. The last overtime victory was was versus Indiana back in December. Before we get into everything, I think the first thing I want to ask you, Thomas, is do you think Florida State played well this game, or do you think this was a sloppy game for this team?
I think you could say that it was somewhat sloppy for Florida State, but you also got to take into consideration the fact that this was their first game since the end of January. Obviously, Florida State was in their second extended pause of the season due to a COVID-19 positive test. So I guess a lot of people anticipated that, Florida State was going to take them a while to get back up to speed. The muscle memory kicked in late in the second half. Florida State, largely thanks to that layup by Scottie Barnes with under a second left in the second half in regulation, they were able to escape.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head there. If Scottie Barnes doesn't hit that shot at the end of the game, we might be having a very different conversation right now about this Florida State team. But like you're saying, it was a sloppy game, and in some aspects, this was their first game back in about 2 weeks from play. But I think I was also really impressed in a lot of moments from this team, because you were talking about that Scottie Barnes shot at the end of regulation, but then they go straight into overtime. And I think up until about a minute left in that overtime period, Wake hadn't scored a field goal for that entire period, and Florida State just went up early. So can you talk a little bit about, we were, just before we started this broadcast, we were talking about the fact that this is Florida State's 11th straight overtime victory. It ties an NCAA record. Also, their 23rd straight home conference victory, which they're now starting to approach the all-time record for ACC conference home victories that was set by Duke back in the early 2000s. I think we've seen a lot of growth out of this Florida State team over this season. I think when we look back at the end of the season, this could be one of those games where you look back to and say, okay, this could be a great starting point for the rest of the end of the season for the Seminole team.
For sure. And you got to give some credit to Wake Forest too. Obviously, Wake Forest, they're under 500, but they approached Florida State the way that they should have, which was trying to beat Florida State from three. Wake Forest, they made 13 three-pointers. And, of course, you got to credit to Jonah Antonio, who was averaging about 6 points a game this season. And he decided to drop 23 points against Florida State. I don't know if he finished 7 of 8 from three, but I know he was 7 of 8 from three at one point. And it's a consistent theme with this Florida State team that if you're going to beat them, you're going to have to beat them from deep, given that Florida State is, probably the tallest team in the country, definitely a top 5 tallest team in the country. You're going to have to beat them with your shooters. You saw that with Georgia Tech. You saw that with UCF. And Wake Forest tried to emulate that today. But, yeah, I think Florida State is growing. I kind of went into this game thinking no matter what happens, I think that this team is still well primed to make a run in March. It's kind of hard to ask a team to come back from a 2-week break and look as good as they were looking when they were winning 5 games in a row in January. But they stepped up when it mattered, and that's just a consistent theme of Leonard Hamilton's teams over the last 4 years. They're just clutch. And Scottie Barnes, for the second or third time this year, he hit a huge clutch shot at the end of the game. And I was telling a friend, I was texting a friend after the game, that Trent Forrest would be proud, because the guy who's making those clutch shots for Florida State for the last few years was Trent Forrest with 5 seconds left, down by 2, or to take the lead at the end of the game. And it seems like Scottie Barnes has kind of, carved that role as the clutch scorer for Florida State at the end of ball games. So if you're a Florida State fan, you got to feel proud of this team and how they, reacted to adversity tonight. Obviously not playing at their best level, but they got it done.
Yeah, and I think you nailed it. Like you're saying, they didn't play their best game of basketball. They certainly played better games this season, but they really made the plays they needed to when it mattered. And Scottie Barnes has been excellent for this team all season. One thing I was starting to really think after the game is, I mean, you were saying it yourself. He was hitting those big shots, those Trent Forrest shots that we would see last season. I mean, he's been the X factor for this team this season. Really, I didn't want to say that going into this game, but after coming out of this game, I think there's no question he's just the X factor of this team. When Scottie plays well, when he steps up to the moment, this Florida State team is going to win games.
For sure, and it's not always on the offensive end. Scottie, he finished, I believe, with 13 points, but most of those points were in the second half. He was missing a lot of shots early on in the game, but he and his other teammates involved. He was making the smart passes, the extra passes. And, you kind of see this every single game from Scottie Barnes. Every time that he makes a mistake on offense, or not necessarily a mistake, it could just be a missed shot, you see him immediately on the defensive end. He's trying to strip the ball, get a turnover. It seems like he's always getting multiple steals per game. He's always involving Florida State on both sides of the ball. And you also got to give credit to Anthony Polite, somebody that we were talking about before this broadcast. The fact that he's back in the lineup after missing a lot of games. When you have those two guys in your backcourt, you have dependable defensive players in both of them. You could argue that they're the two most important defensive players for Florida State, them and maybe Raekwon Gray or Malik Osborne. But having that duo in the backcourt, kind of makes up for other things, especially when you're struggling offensively, which Florida State was. They were struggling a little bit toward the end of that second half.
Yeah, and I think you're right. They were really struggling at the end of the first half, but then they came around. They relied on their defense. They relied on making big plays, and they kept the game close enough to the point that, by the end of regulation, when the game was within striking distance, they were really able to take advantage, and they were really able to put their, I was talking about this with another writer from our staff, Logan, on his podcast a few weeks ago, how this team really needs to learn how to put their foot on the gas pedal at the end of the games. They really need to figure out how to not just beat teams, but put teams away. And while they didn't necessarily put Wake away at the end of regulation, I think what they proved is they can hang around with teams and make every play they need to at the end of games. But something I wanted to touch on, and something I noticed almost immediately, and I was texting you about this as the game started, is we did not see Balsa Koprivica. I'm sure we'll get more news about this at some point soon, probably after the game or during this week. But it seems like he had some sort of tweak and he just wasn't playing today. And without him, I believe we started with a small lineup, but then you saw Tenor Engam and Quincy Ballard come into the game in the early parts. But then by the end of the game and by the start of the second half, Leonard Hamilton really strayed away from that, and he went to a smaller, more guard-oriented lineups. So what's your thoughts about them missing Balsa today? Because I think, this is the type of game where if he's playing, maybe this game doesn't go to overtime in the first place. I think we really saw what they were missing from him today, because he's so important. While he may not stand out defensively, I think what he does for this team defensively and how comfortable he is within the system, that's what's really important for Florida State.
For sure. And, we've seen a huge improvement from this year compared to last year from Balsa. He was pretty raw as a freshman. Obviously, Dominika Lidnicek was getting a lot of minutes last year. And it seems like the same thing could be said of Engam and Quincy Ballard, that they're still pretty raw. And that Koprivica is probably, the one big man, the one center that you could depend on late in games. I don't know if you could depend on the other two. I think that's just what Leonard Hamilton does. He likes to get as many players, as many scholarship players involved as early on in their career at Florida State as possible, because then you see their progression. Somebody like a Raekwon Gray, somebody like a Balsa, somebody like an Anthony Polite, who played a lot of minutes early on in their career, and they're finally seeing the dividends pay off this year. But yeah, missing Balsa was huge. I agree with you. I think if Balsa was playing, I could have seen Florida State pulling away at the end, or at least maintaining the lead that they had when they went into overtime. I mean, you got three combined rebounds from Ngom and Ballard. They only played 13 minutes total. So obviously Hamilton, he didn't necessarily commit to those two guys, making up the minutes that Balsa would have gotten. I think it was smart going with the small lineup because, you were depending on a lot of players with more in-game experience. And I would argue that, the center position is probably the one with the least competitive depth on this team, because there certainly is depth, but I don't think you can make the argument that either of those two players at this moment are near the level of Balsa. So if you're a Florida State fan, you're obviously hoping for his return as soon as possible. And I'm sure we'll hear an update regarding, his injury situation from Hamilton after this game.
Yeah. Well, and I think he's just been hugely important for this team. He's so improved, like you're saying, from last season. It's really night and day, the difference between him last season and this season. But in his place today, we saw Raekwon Gray, who's been great over this last stretch that Florida State has been in, but today he recorded a double-double. He had his career high in points and rebounds, and he was just the engine for this Florida State team at times. It really seemed like, whether it was on the defensive end or the offensive end. I mean, he had that great block in overtime, but there were just so many little plays and little things throughout the game where you can really see just how important Raekwon Gray is for this team.
Raekwon was huge. He played 37 minutes. He didn't miss from the free throw line. He shot around 70% from the field. When anybody can do that, that's just going to keep you. That's just going to keep you in most games. And Raekwon's been on a really nice run recently. That 2-week break didn't affect him at all, apparently, because his career high before today was 19 against Georgia Tech, and that loss right before the COVID pause. And I believe he dropped 19 against UNC in January as well. So I mentioned it earlier, he's just one of those examples of a Leonard Hamilton player, somebody who goes, from being part of the rotation as a freshman, somebody who gets a few minutes. He's guarding Zion Williamson. He's guarding these future NBA players as a freshman. And now here he is as a junior, dropping 24 points, getting 12 boards. And you're thinking to yourself, this is somebody that could potentially play in the NBA. And if you had asked me if I thought that was a possibility when he's a freshman, I would say I just don't see it. So that's just part of the development program here at Florida State, where somebody like Raekwon Gray can, just be a rotational player to a few years later. You're thinking of him as an NBA prospect, not necessarily this year, but certainly by next season.
Yeah, and I think, like you're saying, it's a testament to his progression. But I also, I think one of the things that's really stood out to me about Raekwon Gray this season is his body. I mean, the amount of control he has, just how comfortable he looks playing in his body, whether it's defensively guarding those larger players when Balsa, like when Balsa was out today, or whether it's dominating down low on the post or just wherever. I mean, he's so versatile for this team, and you can see his skill set growing day by day. I mean, this is his 6th straight game of double digits. And I think, like you're saying, if you had asked someone about Raekwon Gray his freshman year and what you think he would turn out like, I don't think anyone could have predicted this.
And it's double digits with Florida State. If you drop 12 points for Florida State, it's like dropping 18 on another team because, you're playing 11, 12 guys deep. So the fact that he dropped 24 points, obviously, it was in an overtime contest, but that in itself is very impressive. And if you're going to do that for Florida State, you're going to have to shoot super high percentage from the field because you're just not going to get that many looks.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And also, something I noticed while I was watching this game is, and I think I was really impressed by this with Florida State, was that, Wake was just shooting lights out At some point they were like 56% from three, and I mean Florida State was as well. They were above 50% from three. They both were, but this Wake team, they challenged Florida State in a way that maybe they haven't really been challenged this season offensively, at least in a close game where Florida State won. And I was really impressed by that. But something else I wanted to get to before we get off here in a little bit is, looking at this Florida State team, if you talk to Leonard Hamilton, he'll tell you the starting five isn't important. And I believe him, I do. But something I'm really curious about is once we get late into the NCAA tournament, the ACC tournament, we're going to really have to figure out how to match up against all different kinds of teams. So, just based off that, what do you think the best 5-man lineup for Florida State is at the end of the games? Because I think, in that overtime period, we saw Scottie Barnes, MJ Walker, Anthony Polite, Raekwon Gray, and Raekwon Evans. But I think ideally, in a really close game, it's probably a very similar lineup, but instead you'd probably have Balsa starting instead of maybe Raekwon Evans. But what do you think about that? What do you think is this team's best 5?
Well, I think partly it depends on who your opponent is, but I agree. It'd probably be Scottie, MJ, Anthony Polite, Raekwon Gray, and either Balsa or Malik Osborne, depending on who you're playing, depending if you want to go smaller or not, or if Balsa gets into foul trouble. But yeah, I think one of those two lineups gives you what you want in terms of, being stout defensively, as well as giving you multiple players who can not necessarily create their own shot, but, get a wide open look. Because, at the end of the game, you're going to be relying on Scottie Barnes, MJ Walker, and then, maybe a couple other guys with open looks, to win a ball game for you. So yeah, I think it'd be one of those two lineups. I think it'd be interchangeable between Koprivica and Malik Osborne as that 5th man.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what Malik does for this team, he's a little undersized for that 4 or 5 position, but he dominates physically. I mean, and he really stands out when he plays against larger opponents. And I've been really impressed, I think, recently with how Leonard Hamilton has figured out how to utilize this team. I think early on in the season, there was a lot of struggle kind of trying to figure out what lineups would fit together, which players he wants on the court at certain times. But the more we played during this season, the more comfortable Coach Hamilton really seems to be with throwing out all different kinds of lineups and really challenging, matchups. Because, and this is something we were talking about before the stream started, was that, they really teams really will try and not match up with Florida State. They'll try and beat them from the perimeter. They'll just try and outshoot them and just have a highly efficient offense. So I think, but even with that, with the 5-man lineups we're seeing from Leonard Hamilton, with what we're seeing at the end of the game, this team is so skilled. And like you were saying earlier, I mean, they're one of the tallest teams in the NCAA. But not only that, all the players that are out there, they're no slouch. There's no one who doesn't know what to do with the ball in their hands at any times. And I think that this team has really been impressive in the fact that, and they were talking about this during the broadcast, you'll see guys who are on the court say, oh no, I want to come off the court and let someone else play, because they think they have so many good players on this team. So, right. Just as we're getting to finish up here, something I want to end with is, do you think this team has too many good players on their squad? And I know the Leonard Hamilton teams in general always have lots of players, and they're usually very deep, and he can throw waves of players at teams, and that's really useful at times, and it's a great tool for their team. But at times it really seems like they don't have enough minutes to go around, whether it's for Sadar Calhoun or someone like Nathaniel Jack.
That's a great problem to have, and I've been on Talking Chop with Logan, and I've said it to him. When you're playing Florida State, you're playing 40 minutes of starters.
Yeah.
Because every single player who plays for Florida State could probably start on an ACC team. And, going back to the height thing, your starting point guard is 6'9". If that's not the case, I don't know if you get that game into overtime today. If Scottie Barnes, he's going 1-to-1 to the basket, you're going to have to put a forward or a center against him if you want to try to get that blocked in most cases. So no, listen, I don't think you could ever have too many good players. And I think Florida State, they've proven this year that they're here to stay in the ACC. You look at a lot of teams in college basketball this year, the ones that tend to be doing better are the ones that aren't necessarily relying overly on one and dones, but it's mostly teams that have great cultures of development. You look at a team like Baylor as a prime example of that. And then you look at teams such as Duke and Kentucky. I don't know if either of them are going to make the NCAA tournament. I certainly wouldn't bet on that right now. I actually highly doubt that's going to happen. But yeah, Florida State, they're definitely here to stay. And, they have one of the tallest teams in the country, it seems like every year. And the class of 2021, they're adding 2 7-footers. They're bringing in 2 7-footers. They have the number 2 class in the country. So there's no reason to believe that this recent run of form for Florida State and Leonard Hamilton is going to end. I don't know if they get the record for the most ACC home wins in a row. Winning this amount of games in a row at home in the ACC is ridiculous enough. And they've had so many close calls, such as the Notre Dame game last year, this game today. There's been so many games since that Duke loss due to the Cam Reddish three-pointer. But yeah, there's no reason for me to believe that, Florida State, that they're going to dip in terms of, their level of play. And I think they're good to go for the NCAA tournament. They're good at playing as a team. Yes, they may rely on a player or two at the end of games, but as I said, it's 40 minutes of starters. It could be any guy on any given night that could beat you when you're playing Florida State.
Yeah, it is 40 minutes of starters. I think you nailed that. And with that, it's not just 40 minutes of starters. It's 40 minutes of starters who have all different kinds of skill sets and who are versatile in all kinds of different ways, to where Leonard Hamilton can really just design a lineup for whatever team he's playing and whatever matchup he wants to exploit in that game. And I think that's the beauty of this team, and a lot of Florida State teams, of course. But once we get late into the season, once we get into March, the teams in the tournament are going to have a really hard time trying to figure out how to match up with Florida State, because on a dime, Leonard Hamilton could just switch out 3 players in the lineup and you could have a completely different matchup that you're dealing with. Yeah,
there's very few teams that are going to match up. As I said, if someone's going to beat Florida State, it's going to be from behind the 3-point line. No one's going to argue nobody's going to make the argument that Georgia Tech is a better team than Florida State, that UCF, a team that's under 500, is a better team than Florida State, that Wake Forest is a better team than Florida State. Any team, any combo guard, they can go off from 3-point land any single night. So, you saw it today. You've seen it multiple times this season. And, as a Miami Heat head coach, Eric Spoelstra likes to say, I'm a Miami Heat fan, you got to weather the storm. And Florida State, they did that tonight. And they've done a great job of doing that over the last few seasons. And that's why they're breaking records, because they're just so consistent, and they're so consistent in the clutch.
Yeah, they really are. And like we mentioned earlier, it was the 11th straight overtime victory for Florida State. That's ties an NCAA record. And it's their 23rd straight home conference victory, which is second all time to Duke. And like you were saying, I think it's going to be really hard for the team to go after that Duke record they have just in this next week. We're looking at number 8 number 7 Virginia, number 17 Virginia Tech. Those are going to be 2 really tough games for Florida State. I'd like to think that they would come out of both of those games with wins, but I think being realistic and having a realistic outlook, I think in one of those games, the Florida State team is either going to struggle or, I think it's going to be a really close game either way. But just looking ahead, we have about 6 games left in the regular season for Florida State. They've played the least amount of games out of any ACC team this season. And I think it's like we were saying earlier, and I think it showed in this Wake game. They were really out of sorts at the beginning of this game. It was some really sloppy play in the first 5 minutes, especially of this game. I think Wake Forest started out with 17 points in that first 5 minutes, and then for the rest of the first half, they only scored 14. So I think what we were seeing today was a lot of this Florida State team trying to get back into the rhythm, trying to get more comfortable on the court. I mean, they haven't been on the court since January. This is their first time playing since the 29th. So as we look ahead and as we're about to end things here on the stream, I want to ask you, what do you think the ceiling is for this Florida State team this year? We're about to have two huge games that I'm sure are going to mean a lot to where Florida State ends up ranking at the end of the season in the NCAA tournament. What are your thoughts for the rest of the regular season for this Florida State team?
Well, I got to preface this by saying that the NCAA tournament's probably the most predictable, postseason tournament in all of American sports. I don't want to put a ceiling on this team. I certainly think that this team could compete for a national championship and, making a Final Four run. But, they could just as easily, lose in the round of 32 to a team that goes off from 3-point land. I think anything could happen. It depends on, they got to peak at the right time. If they're playing their best basketball in March, I think that they could beat anybody in the country. But, they can't play like they did today and expect to win 6 games in a row in Indiana, where the NCAA tournament is going to be held this year. But again, I don't want to put a ceiling on this team. I think it's a matter of time that Florida State wins a national championship. When you look at the quote unquote blue bloods in the ACC, Duke, UNC, UVA, Louisville, they've all won national championships in the last 10 years. Out of all the teams at the top of, the ACC consistently, Florida State's the only one that hasn't gotten to the pinnacle of college basketball. I think they're next. I'm not saying that it's going to happen this year because, as I said, anything can happen in March. But I'd like to believe if things continue to progress at the pace at which they're progressing, if Florida State continues to bring in these top recruiting classes, they continue to bring in these 7-footers and these players that, subscribe to playing less minutes into, being happy with 10 points a game and then being drafted in the NBA lottery. If those trends continue to occur, then there's no reason to believe that Florida State won't win a national championship in the next 5 years. But as for this year, I don't know. I guess I'll say Florida State will make the Sweet 16. But, again, anything can happen. I mean, they just got to stay healthy more than anything. As you said, least amount of games played in the ACC. They got 6 or 7 games left this regular season. So if you're a Florida State fan, just hope that the team is healthy and that they could develop a rhythm and, avoid another major pause due to COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that really is going to be the key for this team. They got to avoid injuries. They got to stay healthy up and through the NCAA tournament. And just as we're about to head out here, I want to do one little fun thing I was thinking about is, I think we have a good feel that Scottie Barnes will probably most likely be a top 10 pick in this year's NBA draft. If not, he'll be a lottery pick. He'll be very high up there. But my question for you is, if I set the over/under at 1.5 players selected for Florida State in the NBA draft, what would you take?
I take the over because I think MJ Walker will be drafted. I think Balsa will stay, and I think Raekwon Gray will stay. I have no basis for making those predictions because I haven't asked them personally. But if I just looked at it from the perspective of, what would be better to their career path, I would argue that, it'd be best for those two guys to come back for another year at Florida State. And I would certainly make the argument that Scottie Barnes should head to the NBA. And obviously MJ Walker, unless he wants to play his second senior season, because with NCAA rules, you could do that. I highly doubt he does that. I think he goes to the NBA. And if he continues to prove, what he could bring as a former 5-star prospect, as somebody who could create their shot better than almost anyone in the ACC, there's no reason for me to believe that he won't be drafted. So I would definitely take the over.
Okay, yeah, no, I agree with you. I think it'll be really interesting once we get into draft season, once we get into the scouting, how teams will really look at MJ Walker, because I think, for a lot of his career, he wasn't necessarily, but he was behind Trent Forrest a lot at times for that main role in the team. And I think he's really shown out this year that, he can be comfortable with any role you give him. He's not just going to be the type of player that's going to say, oh, I need to do this or I need to do that. The fact is that the coach is going to tell him what to do, and he does not care. He's just going to do it. He's not going to question it. And I think that's something that NBA teams will really look at and value, and his leadership. I mean, time and time again, after I asked Leonard Hamilton about the leadership of this team, about the voices in the locker room, the name he mentions over and over is MJ Walker by far and away. And he doesn't really like to name names a lot when he's talking about leadership, but he praises MJ Walker to no end. So we're going to finish up here. We're going to end our broadcast in a minute. And just one more thing before I let you go is we have the Virginia game coming up on Monday. We have Virginia Tech, like I was talking about. Do you have any predictions for those games? Maybe not scoring predictions, but are there any matchups you like for Florida State, or what are some things you're looking at going into that game?
I feel that anytime that Florida State plays UVA, that game ends in the 50s and the 60s. If Florida State's going to win, they're going to have to make a lot of tough shots. UVA always comes at you with one of the best defenses in the country. I'd like to predict that Florida State wins both of those games, because they've really given me no reason to believe that they won't do that. I would argue that Florida State's only loss of the season at home was a fluke.
Yeah.
UCF, when you have three guys, when you have three guys pretty much scoring 20 points and they combine for most of your team's points, and UCF has kind of failed to show up since that game. So I would like to argue Florida State wins both of those games, and that they get to 25 ACC wins. I think they could beat the record, but it's not the end of the world if they don't. The most important thing is, how well does this team do in March? So Florida State fans should definitely, they shouldn't panic if Florida State loses on Monday, or if they lose later in the week against Virginia Tech. They'll be okay. It doesn't matter. Florida State, they beat UVA 2 years ago, and then UVA went on to win a national championship. UVA lost to Zion Williamson and Duke twice that year. Didn't matter. You're most likely not going to play these teams again in the tournament. A lot of these things come down to matchups. But yeah, I think Florida State's definitely well suited to win both.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with you. I think it's going to be two really tough tests for Florida State, and I think this Wake game is maybe not a wake-up call is the way to say it, but a great warm-up to these next two games, because you have a team shoot, like we were saying earlier, 50+% at some point from three. I mean, Wake Forest was lights out today. I think we've only really seen a team play like that efficient when like you were saying, that UCF game earlier in the season. So I think these are going to be two really great tests for Florida State, because if you listen to Coach Hamilton over and over during the season, he keeps telling media that this team isn't done yet, that this is kind of a cake still baking in the oven. So I think these next two games will really give an opportunity for Florida State to measure themselves up against the best in the ACC. I mean, the reality of this season and the way everything's been going with all the post moments is these are probably going to be the two toughest opponents Florida State plays all season in these next two upcoming games. Of course, besides the NCAA tournament. But I think Florida State fans should be really looking forward to that. And I think, like you're saying, that the Florida State fans should not worry about the record of consecutive home victories. That's something that doesn't matter to Leonard Hamilton. In fact, if you ask him about it, he says the team doesn't talk about it. They don't really even think about it. So I think no matter what happens at the end of this regular season, Florida State fans should be really excited that this team can match up with anybody and beat anyone on any given night. And like what we were talking about earlier, I think the ceiling of this team is a national championship. It could be a national championship, but I think they're also going to need some things to go to go their way, and they're going to have to get some good matchups along the way. So we're going to end here, but it was great talking to you, Thomas. I really appreciate you doing this first inaugural live stream. And for everyone watching, you can expect to see this on the FSView Sports feed on our Twitter page, and you can check my own feed by Ben Meyerson. And Thomas, if you just want to plug anything before we go, before we head off.
I would just like to plug the FSU Sports section. I mean, as you said, at FSView Sports, you'll be back at this Monday night. We'll figure out who's going to join you then.
So actually, I just wanted to mention that we do have Logan Grunfeld. He'll be lining up for Monday's Virginia.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So people can expect that, and then we'll be going live for most games throughout the regular season. And if you need any updates on that, you can check my Twitter feed. But thanks for coming on, Thomas. I really appreciate the time, and have a great day, man.
You too, man.